Well, thanks all for coming. Thanks to Frank, Gavin for the invitation. Thanks to Jessica for the logistical help. It's been great. It's only my second time in Austin and the first time I've actually had a chance to spend a little bit of time here, and it's been everything I expected. So, and thanks to all of you for coming out today. The title of my talk is Creative Destruction, which is a little cliched. And it's been a little overused, actually. It turns out I forgot this, that one of my colleagues, Ben Friedman, published a book with that in the subtitle, so I really would look unoriginal if I chose to. So I have to come up with a different title for my book. This is the Glenview Naval Air Station, circa, well, I'm guessing sometime in the 1930s. Those are biplanes, actually. This is what the Glenview Naval Air Station looks like today. That is the Glentown Center. This is in Glenmont, Illinois, not far from Chicago. You can still see that's the old tower, the old air traffic control tower. What you can't see is that that's a Carter's children's clothing store that is now in the old airport. So, you know, a lot of this was kind of given away by the title, I think, and by my perspective, but you can tell where I'm coming from here. It's not all bad. I kind of imagine that's Black Friday with the lights done up that way. But of course, there is a different perspective on military spending cuts, and I became very kind of re-engaged this topic in earnest 2 years ago in 2011 when the Budget Control Act and sequestration heated up, and then it became a hot topic in last year's election. There's you know, quite a wide group of people, including U.S. senators like Senator Ayotte. Governor Romney spoke about it during the presidential campaign. The GOP platform talked about it, that cuts in military spending would not only harm our security, but they would also harm our economy. And this is a pretty consistent theme. Knowing kind of my own experience and looking at the experience, actually the place I looked at most closely in my first book was San Diego, which did experience a downturn in the early 1990s after the end of the Cold War, but recovered very quickly and quite well. That by the late 1990s was one of the most successful economic zones in the country. So I was kind of skeptical, and I said, gee, that's not necessarily the case. But I also go back to Dwight Eisenhower's famous speech. There are actually two that I think go together. They're kind of bookends on Eisenhower's presidency. Most people are familiar with his farewell address, also known as the military-industrial complex speech. He obviously was concerned about the power and influence that had accrued to this permanent infrastructure. And again, this is one of the points he made in the speech, that this is a new experience. We did not always have a permanent military, but now we do. We need such a military today. He never questioned that, but he was always concerned about maintaining a balance. And now I go back to one of the first public speeches he gave as president, April 1953, called the Chance for Peace speech. And you really do see that this concern about having too much money invested in the military would divert resources away from the civilian economy, and in the end, really reduce the country's competitiveness. He worried even more than that. He worried about what he called the garrison state, really the shifting of the balance from the citizenry to the military establishment and to the government at large. Again, he never questioned the need for it, but he wanted to strike a balance. You may not be familiar with some of these lines, but you may be more familiar with some of these quotes. It isn't really that surprising that many progressive and left-leaning groups have seized upon these phrases, wrapping themselves not just in the mantle of a respected military man, but also a Republican, talking about military spending and the trade-offs. These in particular, my sister, who's a school teacher, elementary school teacher, she had one of these quotes on her wall. I can't remember which one it was, on a poster, right next to the one that said, you've probably all seen this, I look forward to the day when the schools get all the money they need and the Air Force has to have a bake sale to build a bomber. You know that one? So this is the context. Now, I hope it's clear that that's not where I'm coming from here. That's not my perspective at all. But I do think that the question of the allocation of resources to the military and the proper balance of allocating resources between the military and the rest of the country is a legitimate debate, discussion. Clearly, we need a military to keep us safe from harm, but the argument that goes along with that is that it has positive economic effects, and therefore that cuts in military spending will have horrific economic effects, I think is subject to scrutiny, or at least should be subjected to scrutiny. So the question is, who's right? Not just me, but who's right? Is it Senator Ayotte or Governor Romney or today's GOP, or is it Dwight Eisenhower, who today, in today's Republican Party, of course, Dwight Eisenhower would be called a rhino. That's a Republican in name only. But this is the way that I think the debate should be engaged. And you start with where the GOP came up with the numbers in the first place that said cuts from sequestration result in somewhere between 1 million and 2 million jobs lost. They actually came from two separate studies, mainly two separate studies done by Professor Stephen Fuller at George Mason University. The first one, actually both of them done on behalf of the Aerospace Industries Association, the leading lobbying firm for the defense aerospace, but also civilian aerospace, obviously. Now, just as an aside, so that you can see the statistics. So the first study estimated that cuts of $45 billion, which is roughly what would be called for by sequestration, would result in a loss of $86.5 billion in GDP and a loss of just over 1 million jobs. Then he came back the following year and came up with a separate study that said that all the sequester cuts, not just the defense cuts, but both the domestic discretionary spending and defense spending, would result in $215 billion in decline in GDP and a loss of 2.14 million jobs. The reason why I point that out is because the GOP spent a lot less time on the second study, because if you look at it closely, you will see that the job losses and economic decline associated with non-defense discretionary spending would have a greater impact than the reduction of military spending. So they just kind of skipped over that one a little bit. Around the same time, in the summer of 2012, I commissioned a paper by economist Ben Zeiker, who scrutinized Fuller's work and concluded that his study and others like it grossly exaggerated the harmful effects of military spending cuts, in part by ignoring the benefits. And I think this is actually the most important part of the story. There is I'm not going to get into the weeds, I'm not an economist, but there is some, I think, legitimate questions about Fuller's methodology in terms of the Keynesian multiplier he used to estimate the secondary and tertiary effects of the military spending cuts. But the bigger point is that he ignored, quite consciously and deliberately ignored, the possible benefits that would accrue from reallocating those resources from the military sector to the private sector. And that's what Zeiker went into in his study for Cato. I'm just going to show just two quick charts to try to help drive home this point, is that you can see that over time, the relationship between defense spending and GDP growth is no correlation, or virtually none, whereas here's the correlation between private investment and GDP, a much, much closer correlation. Okay? In fact, that was the only one of I think Ben mainly looked at 4 different variables, and this was the only one that showed a clear correlation. The other point, just quickly, is that the Zeiker study used $100 billion in cuts to defense spending, which is double what was called for by sequestration, but actually was consistent with a paper that Ben Friedman and I wrote several years earlier. And just to keep all of this in perspective, a proposal to reduce defense spending by $100 billion annually would have amounted to 2/3 of 1% of GDP in 2011, okay? And so, again, the sequester which we're talking about is about $50 to $55 billion. That amounts to 1/3 of 1% of GDP, okay? And when I give these kinds of talks, I tend to focus on that point, that the share of GDP that's invested in the military right now is relatively low. It's about 4.5%, going down. It's actually closer to 4 now, and approaching, and some people will say get below 3 by the end of the decade if we're on current trajectory. When I was writing about the 50s, the spending was just under 10% of GDP. So back then it had a much bigger impact, and yet we still managed to survive and thrive in the 60s and 70s despite those cuts. By the way, another study by Harvard's Robert Barrow and Veronique de Rougy of the Mercatus Center came to very similar conclusions as the Zeiker study from a year before. So the point of all this is that the economists really agree that the stimulative effects of military spending are certainly offset by the cost of the wider economy, and that therefore, all other factors being equal, if we were to redirect resources elsewhere, that we would end up better over the long term. Now, so I generally focus on those two parts. I quote the economics literature and point to the empirical data. I talk about kind of at a conceptual level the benefits of shifting resources from less productive enterprises to more productive enterprises, factors being equal. But when you talk in the aggregate, even that term is kind of not very well received in the public at large. Whenever I talk about military spending and military spending cuts, the first question I get invariably, but especially when I'm speaking on Capitol Hill, is what about the jobs? It's the first question I get all the time. And so I decided to kind of revisit this research, add a number of cases, and look at, kind of augment the economics literature with some stories about what has happened in U.S. history over time when different communities have shifted away from military spending. So here's a couple of the cases that I'm going to look at. I want to emphasize a few points. This presentation focuses a little bit more heavily on the base realignment and closure process, the BRAC process, but I do include a number of cases from before BRAC. We closed bases before there was a BRAC. And also I look at a couple companies that either went out of business or closed or relocated factories, and obviously they made that decision for private business interests, not through some political process like BRAC. All right, so a couple of the cases are fairly familiar, I think, to many people because they're associated with, in the case of the Presidio, a very famous place in a beautiful city, and in the case of Fort Ord, a relatively famous place in a really beautiful place. So in the case of Fort Ord, it's still kind of in the process of being redeveloped. It was closed in 1994. It still hasn't really achieved. In fact, I would emphasize the projected gain number is very much that. It's a projected gain. The redevelopment of Fort Ord has been kind of held up through a whole series of process. But some of it is being used for college and university. Some of it has been dedicated as parkland. And so, again, as someone who, I haven't yet visited, since I started this project, I haven't yet visited Monterey. I hope to get out there in the spring. Certainly one of my favorite places in the country. People will criticize me fairly for picking some of these cases as being places where I like to go visit, and there's some truth to that. Certainly the case here. So it's still a little bit too soon to say in terms of Fort Ord and Monterey. The Presidio, there's a picture from the sky. Here's a little prettier picture, a little more familiar to everyone. Of course, there's a Golden Gate Bridge on the right. By any objective measure, the Presidio should have been one of the most successful redevelopment projects by far, just by virtue of the value of the land in question. Okay. The basic gist is that the cost of land for your house, if you own a home in San Francisco, the cost of the value of the land on which that house is positioned accounts for more of the value of your property than any other place in the country. Okay, it's the land it's on. It's very, it's because it's a peninsula. There's not that much land there in the first place. A lot of the land, actually, the land on the other side of the Golden Gate Bridge is off limits to development because it's parkland. There's a lot of other parkland around the San Francisco area. So scarcity, you know how that works, et cetera. The big story of the Presidio was handed over to the Park Service. That was one of the key differences, I think, in the Presidio case. It has attracted some fairly famous tenants, including Lucasfilms, Letterman. They make movies there, but again, it's still just an absolutely beautiful spot in a very popular city. So I think most people believe that ultimately the Presidio is going to be a success story as well. I think it's still a little bit too soon to say. Or at least what I would say, it will end up being a success story. My argument would be it could have been a success story a lot faster, perhaps, if they had made some other decisions. Another place I look at is a little more obscure, perhaps. I grew up in Maine. That's where I'm from. My mom and dad still live there. So I knew of all three of these cases as a kid. Arguably, the first one, the Loring Air Force Base, way up there in northern Maine, is why there was a BRAC in the first place. Turns out the Maine congressional delegation inserted some language in legislation, riders to legislation in the 70s that made it next to impossible to close a military base because they reasoned correctly that if there was another round of base closures, Loring would be on the list. They were right. It turned out that Loring was on the list. It managed, though, to avoid it the first time around. It ended up being on the second BRAC list, but they were in fact closed in 1994. The announcement was made in 91 and closed in 1994. Now, a quick story about the pictures, some of which I took, and I'll show you the ones I took, but I did not take any of these pictures, just to be clear. One of my research assistants, Cat Forbes, she did a great job putting this together, and the gist of it was, find me some good news stories from some of these places. Well, the best news story from Loring so far is that Fish, the rock band Fish, has held 3 successful festivals at Loring. In fact, I have to read this quote, it's just too good. That the most successful Fish concert recorded was 75,000 people in 1997, which made Limestone, Maine, the largest city in Maine over the weekend. So there you have it. Unfortunately, and again, unfortunately, that's probably the only thing that Limestone has going forward, and I'm not even sure that Fish still has concerts there. The reason why the Maine congressional delegation fought like crazy to stop this from happening is because they recognized that the chances for redevelopment in Loring, in Limestone, Maine, were very, very low. Another Maine base that wound up on the 5th, the last BRAC closure, was Brunswick Naval Air Station, which is Brunswick is the home of Bowdoin College, about 10 miles from Bath Iron Works. So there's obviously still a lot of military industry there. That is, in fact, the Atlantic Ocean there to the north. I have some high hopes for Brunswick. I think most people in the community have pretty high hopes for Brunswick. They've made some good decisions, kind of anticipating that this was coming along, but it's still too soon to say as to what is ultimately going to be the result there. At the time when Brunswick closed, it was one of the largest employers in the state of Maine. So I mentioned that Loring did not make the first BRAC closure, but Pease Air Force Base in Portsmouth, New Hampshire did. They were a bit surprised by this, caught them a little bit off guard, and what I've learned, I actually did visit Pease, and what I learned is that that while it is now counted as a huge success story, these statistics actually come from DOD, that the number of civilian positions when the base was closed was as low as 400. It's a little misleading, and many of these statistics are a little misleading because, of course, when the base closed, it had been in the process of a long, slow drawdown. But by any objective measure, the Pease facility, what now occupies Pease, which is an office park, a business development park, has more civilian jobs than it did even at the peak of Pease Air Force Base. A couple points, though. Again, Cat came up with the fact that Pease Air Force Base now has Pease Development has an airport. And I took that picture, and it's true, they have an airport. But I was there on a Thursday morning at about 10:30, and this is what was happening at the airport on a Thursday morning at 10:30, and that, it was a little weird. I don't know if any of you have ever seen the movie, the movie The Langoliers, which is based on a Stephen King novel, but the premise is that these guys land at Bangor Airport, and the airport is empty. And I had a really scary suspicion that I was caught in a Stephen King novel because it was a little creepy to be there. The gentleman who's responsible for developing Pease is very proud of this airport. In fact, they did put some money into redeveloping it. It's actually rated as an international airport, which is a big deal. You can actually fly in direct. They have customs and all that sort of thing. So that's a benefit. The challenge with Pease and Portsmouth is it's equidistant from two decent-sized airports, and of course Logan in Boston. So he thinks that the fact that you can park for free is going to be a real selling point. I hope he's right, but so far that's not the case. But otherwise, Pease is one of the success stories, and I think that people can learn a lot from looking at that case. And Pease will tell you, the developers there will tell you, that location, it's a real estate play. The business climate in New Hampshire is quite conducive, and so they're feeling pretty good about their prospects. As many of you know, I went to school at Temple University in Philadelphia, and so I took a special interest in a couple Philadelphia cases. The one that I was reasonably familiar with was the Philly Naval Yard, which was closed while I was a graduate student at Temple, and I was familiar with the debate and the anxiety that was engendered by the closure of the Navy Yard. It's obviously, it's one of these iconic structures. When you come to Philadelphia, you're almost guaranteed of driving past the naval base from the airport into Center City. You know, some of the great battleships of the age were built there, and it can be seen right off of 95. It's an iconic place. And I think in the early days there was some real skepticism and some doubt, but I've revisited this since, and it's really pretty remarkable what they've managed to do. Those statistics are pretty accurate as of this year, and all told there are about 10,000 people employed, and they actually think their projections put them at 17,000, 18,000 by the end of the decade. So that would be pretty exciting. They've done a lot of redevelopment. There've been a lot of investment. They do still build ships there. They build cargo ships there. There's a shipbuilder that's built, 18 ships since the plant was closed. So that's pretty significant. I think one of the selling propositions of the Philadelphia Naval Yard is location. It is in a choice location in a pretty vibrant city. A lot going on. There's obviously the educational base there. Healthcare is big in Philly and Pennsylvania, et cetera. So I think the location argument can explain a lot of why why the Philly Naval Yard has ultimately been successful. But here's a place that I have to admit I never heard of before I started on this project. Here's a couple more pictures of the yard. You can see they've managed to retain some of the old structures, but that's actually a community college or part of it there, that picture. So here's a place that I had never heard of. I lived in Philadelphia for quite a few years and had never visited this place. If you know the city at all, it's basically located, you keep going north on I-95 and right past the Betsy Ross Bridge, which is the last major bridge crossing over the Delaware, right along the river is this place called the Frankfurt Arsenal, which in the 19th century was one of the main places for manufacturing cartridges, ammunition, as well as rifles and muskets. And it's a really, and even as late as World War II, you can see the statistics, about 22,000 people employed there. A vast property. I visited there in August of this year. Take a look. I didn't size up this picture properly but if you look at that structure on the right-hand side there, that's what it looks like today. So it's still there, that same structure, the gate. The home is still there and in good repair. This is the home of the commissioner of the facility back then. That structure was retained. So that's how everything looks there. But I started to scratch the surface on Frankfurt Arsenal, and I came across a story in the Philadelphia Inquirer, the local newspaper, explained that employment at the Arsenal today is about 600. So that's well below what they had hoped, and again, compared to about 10,000 in 76. Actually, Walter Mondale visited the Frankfurt Arsenal in 1976 while he was running for president, claiming that if he was elected president, there's no way that it would be shut down. Of course, he was elected vice president with Jimmy Carter, and the base was closed anyway. That sort of thing happens. And there's a story in the Inquirer. In the years since the government shut the facility, dozens of businesses have settled into renovated buildings. Quote, I think on the one hand, it's fair to look at the Arsenal and say it's a success story, says William Hankowski, president of the Philadelphia Industrial Development Corp., which lent $3.5 million to the project 10 years ago. A private developer came in and renovated the property, and it's been put to private reuse, and it pays taxes and has workers and stuff, unquote. On the other hand, 600 jobs is a poor trade for 10,000. He admits that. Another real estate developer, Mark Hankin, who's the president of the management company, which is developing and managing the park, bought the property 10 years ago. Hankin predicted, at the time when he bought it, he predicted it would create 4,000 jobs over the next 5 years. What happened? He said, well, it turns out to be it's hard to raise money, and the real estate market went bust. All sound familiar? You've heard these stories before, right? Hard to get money, real estate market went bust. There's only one problem. That article was written in 1993. 1993. And this is what Frankfurt Arsenal looks like in August of 2013. It is blighted. There's just no other way to describe it. And they're trying. There's still signs. There is hope that they will develop a park there. I certainly hope that it does succeed, but I think it is a cautionary tale that location doesn't explain everything, because again, in terms of location, this is a really choice location. It has easy access to public transportation, right, easy access to the interstate, right on the river, et cetera, but they obviously have some challenges. I also took this picture, I don't know if you can see it, but this is a billboard. They have billboards in Philadelphia. They have billboards in Texas? Yeah. Anyway. A billboard for advertising the Wawa food chain, Give Me Strength. I couldn't help but kind of that juxtaposition there was just too good. So anyway, that's one of the less successful stories. I hope to look at it a little bit more. There are things happening at the Arsenal. There are 2 charter schools that have been operating in there for some time. So I want to look into that a little bit more, but the early indications are that that's not one of the great shining success stories. As I mentioned, Frankfurt was a pre-Brack case. It was closed in 1977. Another one was Brooklyn Navy Yard. Brooklyn Navy Yard was closed in 1966. I took the picture at the lower right, and you can't really see it very well, but actually you can see it. Trust me when I tell you. That right there is the Empire State Building. Okay, so you're looking out across the East River. The bridge is the Williamsburg Bridge. So the Williamsburg Bridge is to the north and the west, and the Manhattan Bridge is to the east. That's where the Brooklyn Navy Yard is. I guess they call that the Dumbo District, which is down under Manhattan Bridge, basically is what that means. Brooklyn's kind of a happening place, and I knew this. This was the first time, though, I visited the facility in August, and there's a lot going on. That's one of the older pictures of the Navy Yard gate, which was rather imposing and not very welcoming. Now it looks like this. There is security there. There's still a gate. You have to have a pass to get in, but it's a little bit more welcoming. And for the first time, they opened the Building 92, which is one of the original facilities in the Brooklyn Navy Yard, which is open to the public as a museum, and people can now tour the property on a guided tour. And I think that's what a lot of people are talking about is, for the longest time, the Navy Yard was just kind of this inaccessible place behind this high wall, and there's more opportunity now for the community to interact a little bit, and you see some of that going on. There are so many great stories from the Brooklyn Navy Yard. This is the shipyard that built the battleship Maine, the battleship Arizona, and the battleship Missouri. 3 famous battleships. It also clad and fitted the guns on the Monitor, the first ironclad of the Union Navy. So this is a very famous place. Quick side note, one of the last ships that they commissioned at the Brooklyn Navy Yard was the USS Austin, LPD-4. I did a little research on what happened to the Austin. It was decommissioned in 2006 and was sold to scrap in 2009, and I believe you could go see it being cut up into little pieces even to this day. So big ships take a long time to cut down into small pieces. But, so that's what's happening at the Brooklyn Navy Yard. I think there's a lot to tell there. Again, this took a very long time to redevelop, but there are hopeful signs. The big shining tenant in the Brooklyn Navy Yard now is Steiner Studios. That's the studio that films Boardwalk Empire, Sex and the City, very successful television and big screen films. They were attracted by the location. It's very close, obviously, to the center of Manhattan, but not being in Manhattan, but also vast tracts of land so you can build an enormous soundstage unencumbered by that sort of stuff. Another case from New York, far, far away, is Buffalo, New York, Bell Aviation. Actually, in my dissertation and book, I looked at two cases. Bell relocated in the 1950s from Buffalo to Texas, mainly in the Fort Worth area. And of course, they moved from fixed-wing aviation to helicopters, which is what they're mainly known for now. But the other big company that moved from Buffalo in the mid-1930s was a company called Consolidated Aviation, which moved to San Diego. And I always like to emphasize this point. Consolidated Aviation moved from Buffalo, New York to San Diego, California, not for the business climate, but for the climate, okay? They were building seaplanes. That was their forte, and they were landing them and testing them on Lake Erie. And they discovered that, yes, in fact, you can build planes and test them year-round in San Diego. You could only do so for a certain period of time on Lake Erie. In fact, my favorite examples, the Consolidated Vultee plant, when it was going gangbusters in World War II, it didn't have a roof on its factory. It was just open because, of course, the climate there is there's virtually no rain at all, and it made it for a very, very good place to move. Last case is one that you're familiar with. You probably don't recognize it from this vantage point. I snapped a couple pictures when I arrived yesterday on my iPhone, and my initial impressions are that you can get really fat at the Bergstrom airport because the food there is really good. There was live music playing, and I've been to many airports in my life, and I've never been entertained by a live band at a airport, so that was kind of exciting. They're big into guitars. I sort of get that thing. But no, honestly, I don't want to make light of this because Bergstrom, I did add this case fairly late in the process, partly because it is such an outlier in the DoD's official statistics. Again, if you look at the percent change, they're estimating about a 470% increase from the decline. Again, the civilian positions is a little bit deflated from the peak, but it is true there are over 4,400 people employed there now. It's actually more than that. These statistics are a little bit dated, closer to 5,000 now. What made it work? Well, what I've learned, even just in the last 24 hours, is that the closure of Bergstrom Air Force Base solved a problem for the city of Austin, which is their airport was completely inadequate to deal with the explosive growth associated with the tech sector in the 80s and early 1990s. And they attempted, before the base was closed, to arrange a joint use deal with the Air Force. The Air Force consistently rejected it, and so lo and behold, when the base was officially closed, the city leaders, made a good faith effort to save it, but sort of breathed a sigh of relief when it was in fact closed and said, now we get to have the world-class airport that this city deserves. They invested in a substantial sum of money in it, $585 million to fund it, but last year they went about 9.4 million people traveled through the Austin Bergstrom Airport, so a success story. And again, this is important to kind of keep in mind. I just learned this morning, actually, is that a number of airline executives were telling Austin city fathers and mothers that they needed to upgrade their airport, but don't overdo it, because they were looking at the example of Denver and also Las Vegas as being a Taj Mahal type airport that were vastly too expensive. Those costs were passed along from the air carriers to the customers, and lo and behold, customers were not as excited about flying into those airports. So I do think Bergstrom is important to keep in mind as a case of not really a problem at all, but a solution to a problem, and one that delivered benefits for the community very, very quickly as soon as it was redeveloped. So last picture, that's Long Beach, California, which I will be visiting next month. I've been there a couple times before, but this is the first time I'll go there for this project. Just a few concluding thoughts. I've already emphasized, in many of these cases, we're talking about real estate, and real estate is location and location and location. That is, of course, the case. But timing matters a lot. Many of these drawdowns are occurring at the time of a soft economy, which is why they're drawing down in the first place. And so if you don't have a diversified economy, or you don't have very strong prospects, that can be an issue. And I learned that very well in the case of Portsmouth and Pease, where I looked at Pease as a shining success story, which I think it is, but the 90s were rough for Portsmouth. It was tough for them to make that transition because the base was a much larger part of their economy, but ultimately they made it work. When you're talking about these statistics, I think it is really important to keep in mind the baseline. Where do you start counting the jobs? Again, if we started counting all the jobs in World War II, that would be really, really misleading. If we only started counting the jobs when the base was closed, that would be misleading too. I think kind of coming up with a reasonable estimate for where the steady state operations of the base were before they closed is useful, but then looking at where the base is or the former facility is and where they're headed. And the last point is, and I know this is the hardest part of all, but it's something that I believed and it's been kind of reaffirmed in the people that I've talked to so far, is that ultimately you have to embrace the change. I liken the BRAC process to the kind of competitive process in a courtroom, right? The prosecutor and the defense attorney have a job to do to defend their client or to prosecute to the best of their ability to make the best case for acquittal or for conviction. But when it's over and you've made that best case, you don't usually question the legitimacy and the authority of the court. Okay? And I think that those instances where city leaders or community leaders made the best case against base closure, but when the announcement was finally made, those that embraced the change and adapted quickly and made a conscious decision to adapt quickly have had much more success than those who either questioned the process or were so kind of committed to holding on to the old that they weren't ready to accept the new. So that's the last slide of my presentation. I'll leave that up there. It's kind of a nice pic. I didn't take that picture, obviously. I'm not a private pilot. But we can stop there. I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have about this topic, but also, well, other stuff in the news, which I try to keep up to speed on. I like to say that as the director, as the vice president for defense and foreign policy studies at Cato Institute, I can be asked to speak about just about anything on any given day, and that's generally the case. So I try to know a little bit about a lot of things. So yes, Eugene.
Well, do you want to take your own questions?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
Yeah,
so,
fine.
We try, just to tell you, to at least initially select students.
Ah,
So
select students.
If you can find a student, that would be good.
Okay.
Otherwise, anyone is open.
I know he's a student. I'm going to call on him in a minute. Go ahead. Yes, go ahead.
How many congressional jobs were lost in the closing of these military bases? So, which I mean, I think as much as congressmen care about jobs in their district, they care about one more than others. And is it common that the congressman would actually lose their jobs over these BRAC?
The short answer is I don't know the answer to your question. It is sort of a small end. You know, even if I did every single BRAC closure, for example, there are about 150 bases that were closed by BRAC. It'd be interesting to look at that. But I'll give you the case that, I just learned about. Congressman Pickle, legendary congressman, represented this district, was part of the Save the Base Coalition, the committee in the early 1990s to stop Bergstrom from being closed. He was not voted out of office because he failed to keep Bergstrom open. Let's just put it that way. I do know of a few other cases, again, just from kind of anecdotes and my own personal experience. My short answer is it's more complicated than that. It might have been a factor in some places, but I really doubt that it was the determining factor in many or perhaps any cases. But it's a good question. I'll have to look at that a little bit more. Good. Over here. Go ahead. Hans.
It's great. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. I have a question about, well, sort of research design. So
I knew he was going to give me this. This is okay. I know this guy. He used to work with me. So okay, go ahead.
well, like you said, it's very difficult to find a baseline, and finding an accurate measure is very difficult here.
Right.
How do you deal with the structural changes? Because it would sort of appear to me, not having looked closely at the data, is that a lot of these bases were not necessarily in very, in areas that were fit for redevelopment. And so when you have a structural change, the chances of redeveloping
Right.
are fairly low to begin with. And so you talk about location.
Right.
It's also part of just a broader economic trend.
Right. I think that, generally speaking, I want the existing empirical research to form the start of my research, like it formed the beginning of my presentation, okay? Is that there is quite a bit of economics literature that says, all other factors being equal, if you cut military spending, it will eventually make its way into the economy, sometimes faster than others. I tend to think, partly because I'm a historian, is that the qualitative measures ultimately tell a different story and augment that other story, don't replace it, okay? So, I'm interested in the statistics, and I'm willing to scrutinize the data a little bit, as I've already shown you. Where you start, where you finish matters a lot. But I am more interested in the qualitative stories. I'm interested in the stories. Tell me what happened. You were living here. Tell me what happened. Tell me, did people leave? Did people come here? Did they come here because this facility was closed? Again, I just learned in the last 24 hours that the old base, Muller Airport, was really inadequate for a lot of different reasons. It was unsafe to fly into. There was problems with the flight pattern that interfered with Bergstrom. There, getting into the city was a challenge, and it was not particularly welcoming, let's put it that way, to people thinking about relocating businesses. So there were real benefits to relocating Bergstrom, to having the base elsewhere. But I think it's a little bit too fatalistic to say, well, a place like Limestone, Maine, its prospects are so bleak, how can we expect it to do anything otherwise? I think that's a little bit too pessimistic. I think that there will be cases, in fact I know there are some cases that I'm looking at, where a poor location does not guarantee failure in the same way that a good location guarantees success. And so what are the other criteria, what are the other factors that went into play? One of the things I've realized from looking at the Frankfurt case, looking at the Brooklyn Navy Yard case, the best analogy I can come up with is, if you build a shopping center in 2007 and you made Circuit City your anchor, that's unfortunate, right? We had one of those in my own town, in Leesburg, Virginia, where I live. That happened. There were definitely some cases like that, where a few of the early redevelopment attempts latched onto what they saw as a kind of, the silver bullet, the big manufacturer that is going to replace the old manufacturer going out. Again, Philly, the early experience with Philly in the mid-1990s was that way too, and it didn't work out. So there are more factors than just location. It's not so deterministic, and I'm trying to tease out some of those more kind of qualitative measures, quality of life, that kind of thing. Yes, sir.
Other case studies are all about domestic military bases. You're doing studies about U.S. military bases closing overseas and how they were used.
I am not. Not because I wouldn't like to visit them, because I'm told they're very nice, and I have visited a few of them myself, courtesy of the U.S. Navy. No. The difference is the politics of it, okay? We did not, or we do not, have to create a BRAC to close foreign bases, right? Because there isn't the need to develop this kind of weird, kind of locked in, all or nothing, kind of washing out of the system, the inevitable horse trading, all that stuff. The people who object to the closure of a foreign base, by and large, are not voting in congressional districts and therefore cannot vote a congressman out of office for failing to save the base. So I don't look at them. I think there's a whole different set of interesting questions related to U.S. bases overseas, but because the politics doesn't factor in, that's why I've chosen not to talk about those cases. There's a lot of other work being done in other countries about redevelopment of military facilities. I'm very interested in the experience on kind of comparing different domestic cases side by side, how they've handled it, how well they've adapted. In fact, there's a conference being held next year, which I hope to participate in, that's talking about that, looking at other cases around the world, and I would present the kind of one of the American perspectives, U.S. perspectives. Other student questions? Or young, yes, go ahead, sir.
Well, I actually am a student.
I guessed that. See, there you go.
Well, first I want to try to answer a question. Do you know David Sorensen? I think from your work
No.
He wrote a book about BRAC a couple of years ago, and he found that looking at the first three congressionally approved BRACs, so 91, 92, 95,
Right?
that there's no evidence he claims that any congressman lost a seat for having voted in favor of BRAC. Now, I think that this is probably not something, if it's true, because there's methods and data and all that, but, and if I seem obsessed with BRAC, I spent an entire year of my life in 2005 working BRAC issues. So,
Okay.
if that's true, I think it is not widely known amongst American congressmen.
Right.
Right, because we
Right.
hear folks in the Pentagon screaming, we need authority to close bases. and
Right.
they're giving it to us.
Right.
Okay, so there's that. Secondly, our friend Byron Cowan is an investment analyst, is of the opinion that, has expressed the opinion it's difficult, I'm getting this from him, that it may be more difficult, all things being equal, even without this dysfunction within the Congress, to approve another BRAC round, in that much of the low-hanging
Right,
fruit
yep.
has been pulled off, and the Bergstroms have been done.
Yes.
And so now we're looking into rural areas where we may have more of the
Right.
fruits.
Right.
How, if you're looking to make the case to a congressman, so think about the policy standpoint here in Washington,
Right.
what is the argument you bring to somebody in Lima, Ohio?
Right.
You need to get rid of your tank plant because it's in Kansas.
Because it's building tanks that are then parked in the desert, because they're not a foreign desert, a desert here in the United States. Thanks for that. Thanks for the insight on the congressional question. There you have your answer. I wrote that down. I'm going to look it up. It is true that there is resistance now to the mere process of a BRAC because people believe that those marginal areas, those areas that would be, again, one of the criteria that went into deciding whether or not to close a base under BRAC was the ability of the wider community to absorb the losses, which is why Bergstrom was certainly on one of the first lists. Okay? And it's harder now. I also think that the experience of the fifth and final BRAC round, because it was occurring when a war was going on and when military spending on the whole was going up, did not really lend itself to good case studies of wise redevelopment, reallocation of resources. Let's just put it that way. Okay, so I think some of the lingering effects, kind of the people have kind of in their mind that all the previous BRAC rounds were as bad as the fifth round, and that's just not accurate. Okay, so part of the purpose of this study is to remind people of these earlier BRAC cases. It is nothing short of shocking to me how little people remember or understand from the early BRAC cases, including people who represent the district or state in which those instances occurred. New Hampshire, for example. So part of the purpose of this is to kind of remind people this was 20 years ago, and let's look at what actually happened. The last part of the puzzle is, in most cases, even in cases where the military as a whole or a base in particular, kind of military industry, military kind of businesses, represent a very large share of the local economy, even in those cases where they represent the largest shares of the economy relative to other districts around the world, it's smaller than it was 30 years ago and smaller than it was 50 years ago, right? It is shrinking. So that it is easier for communities, all other factors being equal, to adapt just by virtue of the fact that the military sector has shrunk. Okay? So maybe it was a legitimate concern. It was a legitimate concern to be very, very worried about job losses in the early 60s or the early 90s. But I think it is less so in most places around the country. And in the few hard cases, I do think, unfortunately, that you're going to have some kind of forcing mechanism that kind of compels the members of Congress to work together on an up or down vote, yes or no. Because all the fact, at the end of the day, BRAC worked. Nobody really disputes that BRAC worked. BRAC worked in the sense that they closed a lot of facilities and it generates real savings. Okay? We would be spending more today than we are because these facilities were closed. And most people now believe that even keeping the force structure at its current levels, it's about a 20% excess capacity here in the United States, domestic capacity. So there is room for another round of closings. Sir, go ahead.
Follow up on his theme, which is slightly off of track. He was talking about the tank plant,
Yes.
which happens to be in Congressman Jim Jordan's district.
Uh-huh.
And touches on what you were asking about, Congressman, is the whole issue of military contracting. And it's well understood that a significant part of the budget is for things the military never asked for to
Right.
begin with. Except congressmen,
Yes.
to preserve jobs in their district, have become military geniuses overnight.
Yes.
Is there research in that area?
Yes, it is true. The military is a jobs program. This is the worst kept secret in the United States. We don't have industrial policy, but we do have a military, and we procure according to what would be the alternative of it's an alternative industrial policy. Doesn't lend itself to good decisions in terms of the allocation of scarce resources for defending us from harm. What's the alternative, though, right? Because I'm a little leery about taking away the power of the purse in total. So you have the kind of BRAC workaround, right, which is still a workaround, but the authority is still vested in Congress. BRAC was a congressional initiative. They recognized they had a problem, right? The first part of treatment is admitting you have a problem, so they came up with a solution. I've heard some talk, and I'm not totally unsympathetic to the idea of having a BRAC process for procurement for precisely the reasons that you say. Is force people to make trade-offs based on kind of the aggregate, kind of get out of their parochial interest or as best they can. But it's tough. I recognize that. Look, again, I mentioned I grew up in Maine, and we still build Navy ships in Maine. And so while it's true that 2 bases in Maine and Portsmouth is right across the river, closed, the significant drawdown in naval shipbuilding would have an effect in Maine. No question about it. But I think at the end of the day, and I say this in my second book, The Power Problem, the moment people resort to economic arguments to make the case for retaining a military instrument, that's when you know that they've run out of good ideas. Okay? Make the case for why something is needed on national security grounds, whether it's a tank, a plane, a ship, a base. Make it on those grounds. The moment you say, what about, and it's good for jobs in my district, that's when they've lost me, and that's when they should have lost most people who care about security as a concept, a broad concept, not because it's good for jobs in a particular district. Sir, Frank Gavin.
Terrific presentation. I was wondering, after 5 rounds, Brack, whether, and especially as you've gone to look around at these, whether various templates have been devised to help communities, because I would imagine the first time it was terrifying, but now we know some things.
Right.
It's going to be different according to where it is. And then I was started to think there probably are arguments and opportunities for some of these bases where you want to be part of the BRAC. I mean, the Bergstrom example kind of, we talked about
Right.
last night a little bit, the hints, it worked out really, really well. You could
Right.
imagine San Diego.
Right.
There's probably some places you say, man, I'd love to get my hands on that land and develop it
Right.
or something.
Right.
Is either of that going on?
I don't think there's a template, because I think the cases are too different. But I do think there are some best practices. And I'm only about a third of the way in terms of even looking at these cases, and I've only visited not even a quarter of them yet. I do plan in the course of this book to visit every single facility that's in the book. One of the best practices, I think, I kind of alluded to this in my closing remarks, is to embrace change, and that means to make a transition quickly, to empower a body, some entity, to deal with the land. Okay, so you have a certain amount of environmental cleanup, and that's understood, and the DoD has responsibility for that. But once the land is deemed suitable for redevelopment, hand it over to a new entity. Sometimes these are purely private, sometimes they're purely public. Most of the time they're a public-private mix. Okay, so you have representatives of the local community, the city or the county. But then you have business interests, and they are considering how to make this an attractive place to do business, build a business, to relocate people, et cetera. And I think that it's particularly interesting to look at the cases that took a very long time and say, again, so the location didn't change, obviously, but something changed that made a particularly unhappy story a really happy story over a relatively short period of time. If you Google Brooklyn Navy Yard, you're likely to pop up an banner ad, kind of celebrating the success of redeveloping the Brooklyn Navy Yard. And so there are people that want to tell those stories, and I'm very kind of open to, what's your explanation for why this worked? Because again, if it's a plant that's been closed for 40 years, close to 40 years, then it's like, well, don't tell me why it's working now. Tell me why it didn't work 20 or 30 years ago. And that's the story. Again, I think the Brooklyn case has been looked at for a lot of different reasons, because it's famous and it's in a hot location. I'm more interested in the Frankfords of the world and a couple of the more obscure cases. I also want to look, I mentioned this, I want to look at the cases. Presidio, people say Presidio is a success. And my answer is, how could it not be? Don't talk to me about how it's a success. Talk to me about why it still isn't close to where it should be in terms of the redevelopment potential for that property. I mean, just look at a map. Look at a picture of that place. It should be just going like gangbusters, and it's been a very, very long process. Sir, in the back.
Have you looked at, as a part of your study, to the Army's organic industrial base? So ammunition plants, manufacturing arsenals, and
Right.
maintenance depots. As the budget goes down, the Army's going to have to consider what to keep open, what to close, and what to do with these. Have you looked at privatization, a solid plan to privatize front instead of actually closing, and whether that would be more beneficial than just doing a drag and just speeding up the pace? And then the same would be true for the other services for their similar facilities.
I haven't, and I might. I'm glad you brought that up. But I'm going on but to privatize a facility and to leave it open implies that that facility is still vital to the national interest, to national security. And I'm going at it from the perspective of, we still have excess capacity. We had excess capacity in the 1990s. We had excess capacity in the 1970s, which is when there were previous rounds of closures. And so privatizing doesn't solve the excess capacity problem. It might provide greater efficiencies, maybe, and I'm willing to consider that, but I'm still going on the presumption that all other factors being equal, better for those facilities to actually be turned over to the private sector for private use, not merely managed for the benefit of the Army. I understand. Is that your question? Is that what you mean?
Well, yes, but I was thinking by privatization, it would be able to get the efficiencies of also getting private business better, instead of just getting
Right.
the military-specific output, but also the argument from the military will always be that this is a national insurance policy for
Sure.
services that are required for the next big war.
I agree, and I understand that argument. Just recently, there was an article published right around Veterans Day, talking about how so many of these bases have become just kind of truly fortresses, but not defending from foreign invaders, but defending from the local neighbors, and the neighbors have no interaction with these places. The security concerns are so great that it's hard to have a dual, so what you're really talking about is some kind of a dual use, right? Where you have some part of the facility that's being used by private businesses, but how do you get around that security problem? One is to say that the security we've overcompensated and we've locked down these places too much. I think that's going to be a really hard sell. Which is my understanding is, I don't really know that it was the security per se, but there has been quite a bit of resistance to the concept of dual use. I mentioned it in the case of the city leaders in Austin in the 80s looked very seriously at trying to develop Bergstrom as a dual use facility, and they ran into a brick wall of the Air Force every single time. So there's a lot of resistance to that.
There's a lot of dual-use spaces around the country.
Give me an example, sir. I'm curious.
Peterson Field in Colorado Springs
Okay.
The Air Force has it, they have a headquarters on there, they have part of Space Command on it, and yet the city of Colorado Springs uses the other side of the base as, for a municipal airport.
Okay.
Many-
I like Colorado Springs. I'm going to add that to my list. I like to visit there.
Albuquerque, we have.
Albuquerque is a very good case. Yeah, Albuquerque is a dual-use base. Albuquerque is a dual-use base. That's correct.
You need to look at, because there are a lot of dual-use bases, and it's sort of a phasing out of the military of those bases where they solely own. But now they, all of a sudden, they find they don't need all the
Right.
base, and they can turn it over to the city, use their portion they need. There are ways of securing it.
Actually, you bring that up, and I didn't mention this. Pease is still a dual-use base, so they still fly out of Pease mainly for refueling missions and things like that. It's a guard base, correct. And the conditions of the turnover were that they had to retain that. So that does put some restrictions, actually does impose some restrictions on how the land can be used. I'm glad for that question. I'm gonna revisit that. I remember Albuquerque's a good case. I remember Albuquerque now.
Military clients are phasing down.
Yeah.
And, here again, we can't afford to have all the military we need, so we'll phase it down, turn part of the property over to the civilians for whatever use
Right.
they want, and we'll secure our portion of it, and then eventually, boom, they're out of there. And they turn the whole thing over.
Look at that.
There's
That's some good input. I'll look at that.
going around.
Colorado Springs, like I say. I like Colorado Springs. Sir, yes, go ahead.
I'll just add a little bit to that. Pretty much every National Guard flying facility in the country is a dual use.
Right, right.
One question for you on the numbers of jobs you're showing up there.
Mm-hmm.
The civilian jobs lost, are you factoring in the military jobs, paychecks that are gone away as a civilian equivalent, or are they in the equation at all?
Good question. No. When they assess, so that's the misleading thing about relying on job statistics, right? Is that does not capture the loss of economic activity from the spending of the service members. You're absolutely correct. But when a base is closed and those service members are reassigned to other facilities, their labor is not lost to the economy as a whole. It's lost to that region, but not to the economy as a whole. So I'm frustrated when I hear people talk about jobs lost, right? Lost to where? Okay, because when a company goes out of business, when they stop manufacturing something or whatever, then yes, jobs are lost. Some people are going to be re-employed somewhere else, and there's a transition effect. But that isn't the case when military people are transferred from a base that is closed to one that is still open. Okay, but that's a good point. The way to do, and again, the presentation is just a very slim snapshot into what I'm doing here, but every time I talk about jobs lost, I will also talk about the economic effects, what happened in the economy, surrounding economy, how do you compare that to the baseline, what was going on at the same time. But that's an excellent question. The last point on this is, there is still, I alluded to this in when I talked about Dr. Stephen Fuller's research, there is still quite a bit of disagreement among economists in terms of how many times you count that paycheck. Okay, right? Because we know the story, the anecdote, right? The service member, he has a dry clean, he gets his things dry cleaned or whatever, and then he buys a hot dog, and the hot dog vendor, all that. How many times do you count that dollar spent in terms of generating activity? Again, I don't need to get into that because the economist's judgment is that it's not quite as many as many people believe, that it doesn't have that many kind of effects. But more importantly, that same amount of money spent either in the domestic sector by government or returned to the private sector in the form of reduced tax burden, either one of those has more stimulative effects than the military spending effect.